morning and welcome to the Parsha webcast. This week we're going to be learning the Parsha of Vayeitzei. It continues the story. I'll give you a brief synopsis of the Parsha, and then we'll zero in on some of the interesting nuances. The story begins, it's really a continuation of yesterday's Parsha, where, if you'll remember, Yitzchak blessed his son Esau. He wanted to bless his son Esau. And Yaakov dressed up as if he was Esau, and he outsmarted Esau and got Yitzchak to bless him. And the truth is, he was entitled to those blessings because he bought the firstborn right, the birthright, from his brother Esau. So he was really entitled to those blessings. But as a result, Esau developed a terrible hatred and animosity to his brother Yaakov, and he decided he's going to kill him. So Yaakov was forced to flee, to run away from his house, from his home, and his mother and his father sent him away, and they told him, you go to your uncle, a man known to us already. His name was Laban, and he said, go live by him. And when his brother calms down, we'll call to get you. So this week opens up with the story that Yaakov leaves Israel, Beersheba, and he goes to the place called Haran where his uncle lives. And over there, on the way, he sleeps. He goes to sleep, and he has a dream, and in the dream there's a ladder that's reaching up to heaven, and angels are going up and going down. There's much symbolism in this. And when he awakens, he realizes that he's on holy ground. So he makes a vow, and he makes a deal with God that if God protects him, he'll do what he can. He'll be the Yaakov that he'll be Yaakov. He'll be the tzaddik that he, of course, is. And he makes an altar, offers an offering, and so on. The next story of the parsha is that Yaakov moves on. God promised him. God gave him a good, made him feel that he's protecting him. So he felt good about that, and he moved on, and he went to Haran. Over there, he comes to a well, and he meets over there a bunch of shepherds, and he asks them if they know his uncle. They say they do. And while he's talking to them, a young girl, Rachel, appears at the well with the sheep, and it turns out that she is the niece, his first cousin, and he was very happy. He kissed her, and she took him to her father's house to meet him. And she came to her father's house. He greeted him, and he put him to work. And he told him, you'll marry my daughter Rachel. You love each other. It's a good shidduch. It's a good match. He said, but in order for that to happen, you have to work for me for 7 years first. He works for 7 years. And finally, the 7 years are up. He says to his father-in-law, his future father-in-law, time has come. I'm going to marry your daughter. And he does one of the most despicable things, Lavan. They set up the marriage, and everyone's there. It's a big celebration. And instead of bringing Rachel as the bride, he brings Leah, the older daughter, as the bride. Yaakov is unaware, and he only became aware of this the next morning, which is a fascinating thing, because even though when they consummated the marriage that night, there's a whole story over here, which I'll tell you soon. And he wakes up in the next morning, he realizes the daylight, it's light outside, he sees it's Leah, it's not Rachel. He couldn't believe it. So he goes to talk to his father-in-law. He says, how did you do such a thing? We made a deal. I worked 7 years to marry Rachel, not Leah. He said, we can't marry the younger one before the older one. Work another 7 years and I'll give you a Rachel. But this time he told him, you don't have to wait for the 7 years. I'll give it to you right away, and you'll work 7 years after you marry. So he married Rachel a week later. And the story goes on to tell us that Leah became pregnant. The Torah describes her as, distinguishes the two sisters as the Rachel having a beautiful face, good features, and beauty. She was very good, attractive. Whereas Leah, it says her eyes were not so attractive. Which also, that alone begs the question, the Torah is describing to us such kinds of what we'd consider, most people would consider insignificant, certainly from a Torah perspective. I mean, a woman's value is not to be measured by how she looks. I mean, why would the Torah make a big deal of looks? So we'll talk about that soon as well. But be that as it may, the Torah does say it. And eventually, God saw that Leah was not so loved. And she, in fact, it says that Leah was hated. And God saw that Leah was hated, so he made her pregnant, blessed her to become pregnant. And she gave birth to one child after the next. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. And she had 4 children before Leah had even one. Rachel was barren. She didn't have any children. And this distressed Rachel very much, of course. And she decided that she'll give her maidservant to Yaakov to have children from the maidservant. That'll be on account of her at least, And she gave him Bilhah. And Bilhah bore her 2 children. And when Leah saw that the maidservant bore children to Yaakov, she gave her maidservant to Yaakov, a lady by the name of Zilpah. And she went and and Yaakov bore 2 children from him. So by now, Yaakov has already 8 children. 8 children. 4 from Leah, 2 from Zilpah, from Bilhah, 2 from Zilpah. Now Leah becomes pregnant again with another 2 times and gives birth to Yaakov another 2 children. So she has now 6, and the 2 maidservants have 2 each. That makes 10. And now Leah became pregnant again. So she was going to have her 7th child. She knew that Yaakov was destined to give birth to 12 tribes, to the 12 sons, the 12 tribes.
She knew?
She knew that. It was a destiny. So she now realized that if she has now another son, that means that's already the 11th son. Mm-hmm. Which means that if Rachel ever is to have children from Yaakov and be part of this family, she'll only be able to have 1 son, because there's only 12. So this was a big problem, because that means that she'll have even less than the maidservants. And that was seen as a very, very inferior type of thing. So she started praying hard that the child that's in her womb should not be a boy. It should be a girl. This way, Rachel could give birth to 2 sons, if she's ever blessed. And lo and behold, the miracle happened, and it was a boy first. The Medrash tells us that it was a boy, and God made a miracle that in her womb it became a girl, which is a fascinating thing. It's just because she prayed so hard on behalf of her sister. You'll see why she owed her sister one. She did, which we'll get to in a minute.
So Leah prayed for her sister?
She prayed for herself that this
boy.
Fetus that's in her belly should not be a boy, it should be a girl. So that this should be 2 boys, that Rachel should be able to, in theory, be able to give birth to the next 2 sons.
Why would she do that?
Because she didn't want Rachel to be less than the maidservants.
So she was kind to her sister?
She was kind, of course.
Oh, I never knew that she did it out of kindness.
Of course.
I thought they were rivals.
You thought, but I'll tell you soon that there's a whole fascinating story of it here. She wasn't rivals at all. Mm-hmm. And so the 12 tribes, finally Rachel does become pregnant, and she has 1 son called Joseph. And next week she's going to give birth to the 12th tribe, which is Benjamin.
Benjamin.
But that's in next week's portion. So Rachel does eventually become the mother of 2 children. Sadly, Rachel dies at birth. This is when Benjamin was born, she died. And she was buried in, not in the ancestral, she wasn't buried in the ancestral the place where the patriarchs and the matriarchs were buried. She was buried in Bethlehem. And we were there, if you remember.
Yes.
We were there at the tomb of Rachel. It's a fascinating place. And we were also at the tomb of Zilpah and Bilhah. If you remember, in the city of Tiberias, there's a tradition that they're buried there. I have pictures. We have pictures. It's there. But so that's basically what happened. And eventually, after Yaakov, and then she gave birth to Leah gave birth to her girl. She called her Dinah. And now that all the children are born, Yaakov decides it's time to go back. You know, I worked 20 years for my father-in-law. It's time to go make my own, for my own, you know. And he went, and there's a whole story of it also with the sheep, how he became rich by giving birth to sheep. We won't get into that. It's also an interesting, miraculous type of thing that happened. And Yaakov became extraordinarily wealthy. And he left and told Laban, I got to go to my father's home, I have to go back to Israel. And he blessed him. They made a deal between them, and they went. And he went back to Israel, and the angels greeted him over there. And that concludes the Parsha. So now let's go back. So if you want, in a nutshell, this Parsha is really about Jacob's marriage to his 4 wives and the birth of 12 of his 13 children. So let's talk about this a little. Let's go back to the beginning. So Yaakov meets Rachel at the well. Loves her. She looks beautiful, as the Torah itself tells us. And he wants to marry her. And he tells his father-in-law, I'd like to marry her. His father-in-law says, work for me for 7 years and you'll have him. I'll give you Rachel as a wife. What happens, as I mentioned, the night of the chuppah comes, the night of the marriage arrives. There's a big party and a celebration, a festival. All the townspeople came as guests, and it was a great time. Everyone was having themselves a good time. And before you know it, Lavan brings out to the bride, to be the bride that he sends home with Yaakov and to marry, was really not Rachel, it was Leah. Now, the truth of the matter is, the Medrash tells us that Yaakov knew by now, he worked for his father-in-law 7 years already. So he got to know this guy a little bit. And he knew that he's not such an honest person. So he always suspected that he would pull off a fast one on him. So what he did was, he told Rachel, I'm afraid that this is going to happen. And it's dark in the house, I won't be able to see you. And so on and so forth. So he gave her signs. I guess Leah and Rachel had the same sounding voice. They were sisters. So it would have been hard for him to distinguish one from the other in a pitch dark home at night. So he made up with Rachel that this shouldn't happen. They made up a code. They made up a code between themselves. That when they come home to consummate the marriage, if she doesn't know the code, he knows that this is not the woman that he's supposed to be with. So they had the secret code between them that not this kind of stunt should not be able to be pulled over him. What Rachel did was, when she saw that her father was doing this and giving Leah to Yaakov instead of herself, she's realized that there's going to be a terrible embarrassment over there in the house. That when she doesn't know the code, so she went over to his sister, slipped her in the code, and told her this is the code. So when he asks you for the code, you should not be embarrassed. He'll think you're me, and she saved her sister from a terrible, terrible embarrassment. That's what happened. The next morning, he wakes up and says, "It's Rachel. It's Leah." He was shocked. He didn't know what was going on. I mean, she knew the code, and that's the whole story became revealed then. But he was angry at Lavan, of course. And the Torah tells us that, as I mentioned earlier, that Leah looked, compromised. She didn't have a good-looking face and features, whereas Rachel looked very attractive. Now, as I asked before, it's very out of character, uncharacteristic for the Torah, which is God's Word, which is a book of morality and holiness and so on, to get caught up with what seems to be very, external, things such as looks, and who cares if she looks good or she doesn't. I mean, certainly Yaakov was not marrying Rachel because of her good looks. I mean, that's totally ridiculous. He was such a tzaddik, Yaakov, that the looks of the woman would be the last thing on his list, if at all, if it would be on his list at all. So why would the Torah make a big deal of how they looked? And the most important question is, even if Leah doesn't look so good, do you have to announce it? For thousands of years later, we should be reading it from the pulpit that Leah didn't look good. I mean, that's not a nice thing to say about someone. The Torah is very careful not to say things that are not flattering and less than positive. So why would the Torah say such a thing? So the question is twofold. Why even talk about women's looks? And certainly if they don't look good, don't say anything, right? If you have nothing good to say, don't say it, right? So obviously there's something over here that needs to have, that lies below the surface, that upon deeper reflection, you will realize that something is here that doesn't meet the eye. So I think, and I know this, the commentators explain this, that what the Torah is trying to tell us over here with these two descriptions of Rachel and Leah is not really about their outer looks. The Torah is reflecting here a deeper reality, a deeper truth. Why did Leah look compromised? Her eyes, it says. The Einei Leah, the eyes of Leah were rakis, they weren't as good as they should have been. So the Torah tells us, and Rashi explains it, that she looked so weary because she cried a lot. She constantly cried. Why did she cry? Because Lavan had two daughters, Rachel, Leah, the older one, and Rachel, the younger one. Lavan's sister, who is Rivka, also has two children. The older one was Esav, and the younger one was Yaakov, Jacob. Now there was this unspoken, I guess, knowledge that the four cousins would marry each other. And Yaakov, the older of Rivka, would marry the older of Lavan, which means that Lavan would marry, Leah would marry Esav, and the Rivka's youngest, Yaakov, would marry Lavan's younger, Rachel. You imagine now Leah, such a kind woman, such a wonderful woman, such a holy woman, and she's going to have to marry this bully, this terrible bully, Esav, who's known for his terrible wickedness. So she cried. She knew that was her destiny, so she didn't stop crying and she didn't stop praying. She prayed and prayed and prayed. To herself, she wasn't outgoing. Inwardly, she prayed all, no one even paid attention perhaps. But the great thing was that she prayed and her aunt's prayers were answered. And eventually, through this very underhanded act of love on her father, she ended up being the wife of Yaakov.
A righteous man.
It was the greatest thing that could have happened to her. And it turns out that Leah had a unique power in prayer. Because later on, now you know why she owed her sister Rachel a favor, because Rachel saved her from that terrible embarrassment when she told her the code. So later, when she's now carrying her seventh child, she knows that this may be a boy, which means that she's depriving Rachel from giving birth to at least two sons. So she prayed again very hard that this fetus should be a girl, not a boy, and God answered her prayer once again. So she paid back Rachel for her kindness, and her prayer was answered, and there's peace in the family, everyone's dignity was restored, and it was a wonderful thing. But now I want to turn your attention in the same story to their offsprings, and to see how the destiny of the offsprings was similar to the destiny of the parents. In this parsha, Leah and the two maidservants give birth to 10 children. Rachel gives birth to one son, and then later in next parsha another son, Joseph and Benjamin. But let's talk about this parsha. Rachel's the mother of Joseph, and Leah is the mother of the others, because they were the two main wives. Let's talk about these two women for a minute, Rachel and Leah. Yaakov is at the well, and he's talking, and he's in conversation with the other shepherds, the town's shepherds, and he asks them if they know Lavan, if they know his uncle, where he lives, give me the address, right, that type of thing. And they know him. He's a famous, he made a famous name for himself, Lavan, probably in cheating, who knows what. And while he's talking to them, Leah appears with the sheep to give them water. Now Leah, as you know, was the younger daughter, younger sister. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm sorry, right, thank you. Rachel appears with the sheep. Mm-hmm. And Rachel is the younger daughter. And you wonder why is Rachel the younger daughter going with the sheep to the well and not the older daughter? It would make more sense that such a job should be done by the older, the stronger, the more reliable, Turns out that Leah was a woman she was praying while Rachel was out doing her thing. She was a very inward, reserved, introspective person, Leah. Whereas Rachel was the one that went out. She engaged the world. She was the active one. Interestingly enough, later when both these women die, it will be Leah that would be buried side by side with Jacob, whereas Rachel would be buried distant from him, some 20 miles away, in Bethlehem, not in Hebron. And the Torah tells us later on
the prophecy
that was the fulfillment of a prophecy. Why?
Is it Jeremiah?
Yes, it is. But there's also there's an interesting symbolism here. But what the Torah tells us is that when Rachel was, when he came to bury her, when she died on the way, she died en route, she died on the middle of a travel. So he buried her on the road. It's literally on the road if you're ever there. And God told Jacob and Rachel that, don't worry, this is a good thing, because there's going to come a time that her descendants, the children of Israel, will need her buried where she is, because when they'll be driven out of Jerusalem, she'll be there. There'll be a gravesite for them to go and pray and get strength, because she's literally buried at the exit of Jerusalem. Bethlehem is right there. So when the Jews are driven out by the Babylonians, they'll be able to have right there a grave where they can get comfort and pray to her, and she'll be there and pray on their behalf. So it turns out that Rachel became the matriarch that was the one that gave solace and gave strength to the children as they're going to embark on a new journey into exile. What is exile? Exile is a time when Jews are asked to go out to the world and become the light unto the nations and become an influence. So again, Rachel represents that outgoingness. When Jews are meant to go out of their comfort zone of Israel, their holy, cocoon, their environment, to go outward. And we know that exile is not just a punishment. Of course, it's a destiny. It's a purpose for exile. Where Jews are asked to go out, that's the time when we become influential in the world. When we mingle with the world, when we're around them, they can see us, and we can be of a positive light onto the nation. So there again, Rachel is that, the person that matriarch, that figurehead, that gives the Jews that ability, that when they go out to become that light unto the nations, that they should be able to do this. Very different from Rachel. I'm sorry, very different from Leah. Leah is the one that is lying with and buried with Yaakov, always inside, praying, it affects her even outward looks. And that's the difference between these two wives. Now let's take a look at the difference between their children. How the children have the same destiny. Leah's children are the two tribes, whereas Rachel's children is Joseph. Her child in this parsha is Joseph. There's a great contrast between all the tribes and Joseph. What was the difference? We're going to read in 2 weeks from now the terrible story of how they sold Joseph and wanted to kill him. They actually wanted to kill him. It was Reuben and Yehuda that saved Joseph from being killed. They said, "What do we have to kill him? Let's sell him. This way we don't have blood on our hands." But either way you look at it, they certainly didn't want him in the picture. They wanted to get rid of him either for good or out of the picture, go to Egypt, but be away from us.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that Reuben also lost his first birthright when he committed? So it's like the story kind of repeats himself again?
A little bit. But not exactly, because over there, you mean it repeats itself what happened with Yaakov and Esau?
And Esau, mm-hmm.
There is a similar thing, because Reuben ended up not being the leader of the tribes. It was Yehuda. That's true, and Joseph.
Joseph, mm-hmm.
So, where was I? Oh, so they want to kill Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they want to kill him? Because their father bought him a nice tunic?
No.
That can't be. That's ridiculous. They were jealous of him. So if you're jealous of someone, you kill them. The tribes were holy people.
I think he was blessed.
They were the tribes of Israel. How could they want to kill their brother? It's so out of character. It doesn't even, and even the sale is ridiculous. So what happened over there? What's really going on?
Okay.
Of course, this was a debate. This was a spiritual debate that was going on between Joseph and his brothers. The debate went as follows. They knew that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the fathers of a new people called the Jewish people. And they knew that this Jewish people had a destiny, had a purpose in this world. They were meant to be the chosen people, chosen for holiness, to be God's people here on earth, to be the holy nation of Israel. Now this brings us to the question of what is holiness. How are you to be a holy person? How is a person meant to be holy? So, if you didn't have the Torah, and this is before the Torah was given, you have to understand this.
Way before.
It's way before. Some 200 years before, or more, 250 years before. Some 200, maybe even more, some 270 years before the Torah was given. They don't know anything about Torah, about mitzvahs. They heard it, their father kept it, but it wasn't so what does it mean to be holy? What does it mean to have a destiny of godliness, spiritual, holy, and so on and so forth? Is
it to be able to display some of the qualities God has, the attributes of God? Because some people, they never read a book, but they show God's qualities.
So that was the question. How is this people, this Am Hanifchar, this chosen nation, meant to be living here on earth as a holy nation? And this began a debate between the brothers. And they thought, as most people would think, that the way to be holy was to be secluded.
Apart from the world?
Away from the world, exactly. How? Why? The world was a very, very not pleasant place. It was contaminated. They worshipped idols. They were promiscuous. It was it wasn't a holy place. They felt that the way to be holy is to be secluded. That's why we find that the tribes were all shepherds. They chose the profession of being a shepherd. I don't know if you ever saw what shepherds do, but I did in Israel sometimes. When I was there as a boy, I went to the Arabs. They're all, a lot of them are shepherds, and it was before the Intifada, so it was, you can go wherever you wanted. So I saw a lot of them are shepherds. What do shepherds do? They go into the mountains. They take the sheep out to the mountains. They graze. What do they? And they're spending time. The sheep are spending time grazing and hanging out. What does the shepherd do at that time?
Well,
sits and looks at the
David
sky.
used to
What
sing.
does he do?
David used to sing to
so
God.
David was a shepherd, and he would sing the praises to the Lord.
Amen.
Yeah. All these people were shepherds. They chose themselves. Anyone that wanted to be a little bit separate from the mundane world around them chose the profession of being a shepherd. Because the shepherd gave them the ability to go away from the world, go into nature, and become one with God, to focus on Hashem. I mean, think about it. That's what they did. There are even songs in Yiddish, and even in Hebrew and in English, there are songs about shepherds. That's what they do. They dream, they fantasize. They're thinking about other worldly things. They don't have to engage in the mundane, physical surroundings around them. They can be away from it all and elevate themselves, be a little bit aloof. Not in a negative way, in a positive way. That's what the brothers wanted to do. And they felt that being a shepherd and being secluded, and not the shepherd, but being holy, meant being separate from the world. Okay. Joseph had a different attitude altogether. Joseph was the one that came up with the idea that being holy maybe means to engage the world and teach the world and be involved in the world and transform the world.
And he was pure.
He was pure, of course he was pure, but he wasn't afraid of going into the world and engaging the world. He felt that he could do it.
And he did it.
That the fact that Hashem gave us a unique neshama gave us the ability to engage the world and be one with the world and never be influenced by it. The brothers, on the other hand, saw him as a danger. You are putting the Jewish future in danger. You are going to undo the destiny of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is our destiny. So they saw him as a threat. Not just they were jealous that he was getting a love, that Yaakov showed him great love. That wasn't what bothered them. Well, there was a much deeper philosophical, ideological debate and argument that was going on between them. And they felt that Joseph was such a danger that they had to eliminate him. Because otherwise, if his opinion penetrates, we are going to be lost. The Jewish people will not be able to have a future. And they saw Judaism on the line. To them, Judaism was in danger with Joseph's appearance. Because that's what he promoted. And that's why they wanted to get rid of him. That's why they sold him. What ends up happening, of course, we know the story. Joseph ends up in Egypt. And over there becomes the viceroy of Egypt and becomes the leader of the world.
And he proved himself pure.
Exactly. He proved himself pure. When the tribes come down to Egypt later, when there was a famine, you know the whole story, right? Mm-hmm. They end up coming down to Egypt, and they meet face to face with Joseph, not knowing who he was. And the Torah says they didn't recognize him. So what does it mean they didn't recognize? You can say simply they didn't recognize him because he looked different. It was 22 years later, and they didn't recognize him. But it probably means more than that. When they say they didn't recognize him, suddenly they saw a person that was with a beard, looked holy, looked like he was not a regular Egyptian. You could see that he was a holy person. And yet he's running the world. They didn't recognize. How could such a thing be? Their opinion all these years was that if you're going to be in the world, you're going to compromise your holiness. Suddenly over here, they see face to face the first time a person that's fully engaged. He's not only engaged, but he's on top of the world. He's running the world. The whole world economy and the world security. He's running everything. And he's a yeshiva boy. He's holy like a yeshiva boy. They didn't understand it. That's what they didn't recognize. How could they? And they recognized finally that he was right. So that was the big debate. And where does this come from? The difference between Leah and Rachel. Again, Leah was what? The person that was inward, prayed all day, to the point that it affected her outer appearance. Rachel was the one that was going out to the well. She was engaged with people. She was talking to people. Ends up the end of the life, Rachel dies on the way and becomes the source of encouragement and inspiration to the children of Israel that will leave the holy environment of Israel and go into exile to become the Yosef of the world, to become the influence of the world like Yosef was in Egypt. So Rachel represents that motto, that idea, and therefore her son Joseph represents that idea. Whereas Leah, who's secluded, praying all day, and her prayers are powerful, we got to give her that, that's for sure. She was a tzaddikus, she was a holy person, that's why she's buried together with Yaakov. But she's the person that remained inside. And she's the person that prayed hard. And she's the person that engaged in a fully holy spiritual life. Whereas Rachel also did, but in a very different way. In a very outward, influential way. She mingled with the people of Haran, the place where she lived. She was out there by the shepherds, and she was talking to them, and so on and so forth. So this is the beautiful story of the beginning of the story of the tribes. How every step of the way, from the beginning, from when before they even born, their mothers, how their marriage happened, and everything about them, even their outer features represented this idea. Everything about them represented this distinction, this contrast between Rachel and Leah, between Joseph and the rest of the tribes. And that became, later on, the motto of the Jewish people. We are called by the name of Joseph. In the Tehillim, King David refers to the Jewish people as Tzayin Yosef, the shepherd, the sheep of Joseph. We are the people called by the name Joseph, because at the end of the day, Joseph's victorious. His motto, his idea was victorious, and that's when the dreams. What happened over there with the dreams? Yeah, he dreams and they get upset, right? What is he dreaming about? He's dreaming about greatness. He's going to be the king. Again, it's not that they were jealous. It's that they were afraid that this man is putting an end to Judaism. And they saw his influence. They saw his charismatic character, and they saw he may take us over and end Judaism as we know it. Because he's going to mingle with the world, and holiness cannot be promoted and promulgated and lived with that kind of attitude. So they felt that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their whole life's mission was going down the drain. So that's what happened. So when it says that Leah's features were compromised, and Rachel was of beautiful, appearance, it's not just the physical beauty. It's representing something deeper. And that eventually gave room and gave birth, that brought about the two contrasting opinions and mottos of the brothers as opposed to Joseph, which led to the whole story that the rest of Genesis talks about. It's all about this story. It's all about this struggle. It's all about this destiny. And it ends up that at the end of the story, of course, we know that Rachel, the mother of Joseph, and of course Joseph, are the ones that become the great provider and the great inspiration for the Jewish people. Joseph while he was alive, and Rachel even while she was buried in Bethlehem, she becomes a great matriarch that allowed for the Jewish people to maintain themselves during the exile, because she was right there when they left. And that's why she was the one that had to be buried there, because it was her motto, it was her idea that gave the Jewish people that strength and that ability to leave the confines of a holy environment and go out into exile, where we are meant to then really become the light unto the nations. That was what Joseph was all about, because that was what Rachel was all about. And that's ends up being that's the story that begins in Vayeitzei and ends at the end of Genesis. So it really never ends. It's just That's the motto of the Jewish people till Mashiach comes. Yeshua Koyach.